In the early 1920s, a young man was born and raised in Chicago, and he had this dream. He loved to draw. He passionately wanted to be an artist. And when he was in his young 20s, he got a job with the Kansas City newspaper as their illustrator. He was ecstatic. Except shortly after, his boss called him in and summarily fired him because he said the young man was, quote unquote, lacking in imagination. You know, why am I starting with such a sad story? It would be sad, except the man's name was Walt Disney. Walt Disney went on to do, among other things, buy ABC Networks, which owned the Kansas City newspaper. Colin Powell, the amazing Colin Powell, was a C- student, and even he said he didn't think he was going to amount to much. And the great Michael Jordan, guess what? He didn't make his high school varsity basketball team. None of these great men had what we would call the it factor. They didn't have brilliant IQs. They didn't have incredible physical prowess. They weren't unbelievably creative. You know what they had? The grit factor. G-R-I-T. Guts, resilience, initiative, and tenacity. We used to be a country that really valued grit. That's how we grew this great country. That's how we got through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. But today, we live in a world that's enamored with overnight YouTube sensations and stardom that comes from a selfie. And we watch The Biggest Loser. Anybody watch The Biggest Loser? And we see somebody shed 40 pounds between commercial breaks. What we don't see is the little fine print that says that took this guy 8 months to do with diet and exercise. We don't want to see all the sweat equity. We don't want to be bothered with it. But here's the real truth. Of people who are really born prodigies, those select few, 2% of them grow up to be successful at anything. 2%. But 98% of the people who are amazingly successful were pretty average, except they had grit, they had perseverance, they had tolerance, they were able to keep on going. And that's the fact. Anybody can possess grit, and if you don't think you possess it, well, you can learn to get it. I mean, if I can do it, anybody can do it. I was a not very rich girl that grew up in the Bronx. Ever heard of the Bronx? I'm not going to start talking like I'm from the Bronx, but I'm from the Bronx. I had a public school education all the way. I went to City College of New York. Not complaining, I had a great education. And ultimately, City College gave me something that no Ivy League school did, mainly an acceptance letter. And when I got out of college, I wanted to be a performer. I wanted to perform in the worst way, and I think I probably did perform in the worst way. I was in off-Broadway, off-Broadway, and oh boy, is that off-Broadway. I also was in a comedy troupe for a while, and we were in the first variety show that was on cable television, okay? It was on Cable Access D. I think if we had been any funnier, we might have made it to Cable Access A, but there we were. But we had a huge following. His name was Dave, 6'4", and he followed our every move, as any good cameraman should, because he was about the only guy watching. As much as I love performing, there was something I actually loved more, and that was eating. So I decided to pursue a job in advertising, and I found that I loved that even more. And my first day on the job, I was so thrilled, because my boss told me that I was going to be writing 25 ads for Kodak, and they were going to be broadcast at Kmart over the PA system. I walked in, I thought I did a great job. I stayed up all night. I gave her the ads. I thought they were brilliant, and she thought they were awful. Linda, you're going to have to go back and do them all over again. I said, no problem. As I walked out, she said to me, Linda, I think that you were going to end up owning your own ad agency one day. And I said, oh, because you saw something promising in those ads? She said, no, I saw nothing in those ads. But what I did see is somebody who was very resilient, who wasn't crying who's willing to go back and do it over again. And in this business, most of the time the clients hate what we do, and we do it over and over and over and over and over again. Does that sound familiar in the business that you're in? Well, I took that advice, and I think it worked out pretty well. I've been in this business for 35 years. Yes, I started when I was 4. And 17 years ago, I did decide to open up my own ad agency with one piece of business, herbal essences. Do you remember that woman in the shower? She was having way too good a time in that shower. Yes, 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 that's the one. Today, we merged with Publicis to become Publicis Kaplan Thaler with billions of dollars in media billings and about 700 employees. And if grit's the best predictor of success, nothing propels success faster than failure. Failure after failure after failure. You know, Michael Jordan once said, I fail and I fail and I fail, and that's why I succeed. James Dyson was a failure for a long time. Anybody heard of Dyson vacuum cleaners? Right? You see a brilliant, creative invention. What you don't see are the 5,126 prototypes that he created that totally sucked. Or maybe I should say didn't suck. That was the problem. So why are we so afraid to fail? And even worse, why are we afraid to let our kids fail? Why does everybody get a trophy now? Any other helicopter parents out there? Yeah. When my daughter was 5, we bought Emily a beautiful pink bicycle, and we couldn't wait to teach her how to ride. I took her to the park, and I put her on the bicycle, and I put her hands on the handlebars, and then I walked with her. Let go, and she fell. Did it again. Held on as long as I could, because I didn't want her to fall. Let go, and she fell. 2 years, and many Advils later from my aching lumbar, I came to the conclusion that my beautiful daughter would someday maybe win the presidency, but she was never going to win the Tour de France. On her 7th birthday, undaunted, I'm a woman of grit, I got out there with her on the bike, and we did it again, and she fell. A man in his mid-70s, a cyclist, came up to me, and he said, Mom, I see you're having a little trouble teaching your daughter how to ride. I know how to teach kids how to ride. I said, okay. He balanced her on the bicycle. And I said, well, yeah, I've done all that. He said, oh, but Mom, I didn't tell you what you need to do. I said, what do I need to do? He said, take your hands, this was it, the magic formula, and put them in your pockets. Take your hands and put them in your pockets. He gives Emily a push. She goes a few feet and she falls. I run to pick her. Take your hands, put them in your pockets. He pushes her again. She falls. I'm sweating, I'm so fearful. 3rd time he pushes her, she keeps going and going and going. Our daughter Emily is 19 years old. She's an expert cyclist, figure skater, equestrian, an all-round balanced young lady. And I like to think I've had a hand in her success. Mostly because I've had the good sense to keep them in my pockets. Now, deciding you want to embark on something and actually getting there, there's a lot in between. You know what they call that? They call that waiting, and waiting, and waiting. A lot of stuff you got to go through to get from here to there. And a lot of us get distracted and demoralized along the way. So what are some tips? What are some things you can do to sort of keep you on track? The first thing is solve small problems. George Polya is a famous mathematician who said the biggest problem we have in the world is that people are trying to solve problems that are way, way, way too big. You have to break down these problems into small, manageable bits that you can do every day a little bit at a time. The other thing that does, it keeps you in the now, so that you're not busy thinking about a future that you can't really control anyway. The second thing you need to do, don't laugh at me, is make your bed. Admiral Willie McRaven is a former Navy SEAL, and he teaches Navy SEALs, and the first thing he teaches them to do is to make their beds. And he is convinced that this is the way that everybody needs to start their day. Why is that? And of course, these cadets think he's nuts. He said, first of all, when you make your bed, you will have already accomplished something in the morning. So if you've accomplished nothing else for the rest of the day, you're going to feel good that you made that bed. Secondly, you learn to do something very small perfectly. And once you learn how to do something small perfectly, it helps you to do bigger and bigger things perfectly. It gets you into the habit of perfecting things. The next thing I have found to be of help is finish what you start. Now, you have some big, massive goal ahead of you, but how about getting yourself into the habit of finishing the really small goals? Like, there's a kitchen drawer that's a mess. You know what? Instead of telling yourself, tomorrow I'm going to clean it out, don't use any excuses. Clean out the drawer. You get a great feeling of endorphins when you do that. And it helps you getting into the mode of like, yes! Now I'm going to talk about willpower. And I'm going to give you great advice. Forget willpower. We don't have enough willpower to use our willpower. Nobody's that strong enough. Temptation is too great. And by the way, by the end of the day, you lose all your energy anyway. Instead, put yourself in situations where you don't have to use willpower. I know for me, I'm on a task and I'm so tempted to see if a text has come in on my phone. And then I realize, I need to put the phone in a room far away from me, so I'm not going to be tempted. You're in the car and you're afraid of, answering a phone. One thing that I do now is I put it in the back seat in my handbag, so I can't get to it. And by the way, if one of your goals is to lose weight, forget about, trying to use willpower to not eat something. If you go to a restaurant, I have a better suggestion, something that a researcher came up with recently. You see somebody has a delicious chocolate mousse, and you really want it. Now I want you to visualize a cockroach in the mousse, lapping it up. How many people here will never eat mousse again after I told you that? And one of the best things that you can do with this newfound grit is use it to help somebody else. Using your grit for good. Don't you feel good when you do something good for somebody? That's because when you do something good for somebody, the same part of your brain lights up as when you get money or you give somebody a kiss. Oh, I see a lot of happy people out there. And you can use that grit to help millions of people or just to help one. Like my friend Brian. My friend Brian works at Covenant House. And 20 years ago when he first started, he was in the LA office of Covenant House. And Covenant House is for, teens who are homeless. Many of them come from foster homes. And he would grab kids off the street and they would try to rehabilitate them. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But there was this one young man, Reese, he kept picking up off the streets. And Reese was about 18 or 19. And Reese was a crystal meth addict and was panhandling on the street, homeless, no parents to go to. But every time he would take Reese in, 2 months later, Reese was back on the street again, back on with drugs, back into his life. And Brian used every tenacious idea he had, and he couldn't help Reese. This went on month after month. And one day, he picked Reese up. He said, Reese, you know what? I'm going to take you to a place that you can live for as long as you want. It's going to be your new home. Reese was ecstatic. He imagined a beautiful house with a white picket fence. And you know where he took him? He took him to Skid Row. There it is. There's your new home. With the rats and the fire pit and drunks. You can't do this. You got to take me back. You got to take me back to Covenant House. No, come on, Reese. That isn't working. Let's just cut to the chase here. Reese begged and he finally brought him back to Covenant House. Shortly after, Brian was relocated to Oakland, California, and that was the last he heard of Reese. 10 years went by, and he gets a call from the head of Covenant House in LA. Hey, Brian, do you know somebody named Reese? Oh, man. He's got to be close to 30 now. What does he look like? He looks pretty darn good. He's got a jacket and a tie. He owns his own construction company. He has a family, and he walked in with a check for $10,000. And he also has a message for you. If you see my friend Brian, you tell him that the day he took me to Skid Row was the last day I ever took drugs and the day I turned my life around. Brian had used his grit, his guts, his resilience, his initiative, and his tenacity to transform one man's life, proving that maybe one of the best things about grit is that we can pass it on to somebody else. Grit is humanity's great equalizer, because you don't need to be brilliant and you don't need to be talented, and if you don't have it, you can learn to have it. And you can get it at 1 and you can get it at 100. So I ask you, and we talk about asking questions today, what is your passion? Find it, get your grit on, and go for it. Thank you.